What would your top tip be for a couple when I guess they are considering moving in together?
Yeah. It's something that I'm really, really passionate about, and I think more so now than ever before, is having open, clear communication early. And the more work that you can do in the early stages, the less work you'll have to do later on. And I think it's a problem that we have as a society generally. It's not just related to family law, but there's a real resistance to have hard conversations. No one likes it. No one likes conflict. And the number of times that I say to clients, well, we could do this and it involves having to have this conversation, and they say, absolutely not. I don't want to talk about that. We're not going to go there. And I think then what happens is you go into a relationship with expectations or assumptions about how you'll be in a certain situation or how the other person will be, not really understanding what their values might be around money or what their reaction might be to certain circumstances. Do you even know whether you can live together or how you can live together if they're going to drive you crazy by something that they do? And I think just really simple things like having some discussions about those things and working out, do you even know what your own values are? Do you know what your habits around money are? Do you know what expectations or assumptions you might have around that? For example, just really basic things like, have you thought about how bills will be paid and how that will work? Will they be shared equally? What happens if someone loses their job or if they are unwell and they can't work? Do you still have that same expectation around what their role might look like? Do you plan to have children? Do you plan to get married? And sometimes you don't want to think about those things early on. But the reality is that the problems that I see at the tail end of the relationship is largely because people haven't had any of those conversations in the early days. And I think the more you can actually think about, well, what is it that is really important to me in terms of money or in terms of roles and values around money, and am I compatible with this person? And what happens when there's conflict? Can we work it out? Can we talk about it? Are we on the same page?
Yeah.
And if you can keep those conversations going, then generally they're the people that will be okay.
So have the conversation early and cover everything up front.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, just by nature of the financial agreement process, it involves a huge amount of discussion and disclosure about your circumstances and questions from annoying lawyers like me saying, have you thought about getting married? Have you thought about having children? Have you thought about what happens if someone gets sick, or what if they win lotto? So you might say, well, I really want to protect my house. Would you still feel like that if your partner won $10 million in lotto? Would you still be okay to keep your assets separate? And so that's part of, I guess, my role in the early stages, and it's something I would encourage people to do early, is to get advice. And it's something that most people probably would never think of, to get advice from a family lawyer going into a relationship, because it's generally something you would associate with separation. And people usually wouldn't think a family lawyer might be able to help save a relationship. But in some ways we can say, well, if you have this conversation and do this and this and this and this, it can actually help you to stay together and to, be aware of the things that could go wrong and fix them before they go wrong.
See, I think a lot of people would hear the term family lawyer and think, well, we don't even have a family yet, so why would I be talking to a family lawyer before moving in with someone? But you're saying that is the person you would still call before you move in?
Yes. So, and I the best time to get advice from a family lawyer is in the context of parties that are wanting to protect their assets before you move in, or at least before you've lived together for 2 years. And in the context of people that are potentially separating or having some rockiness in their relationship, before you separate and before you have discussions around the separation, because it's really important that you enter those discussions from a position of knowing what your rights are, knowing what you're entitled to, knowing what risks, but also knowing what the process looks like and what to expect, because people have really different and often unrealistic expectations about what the family law process looks like and what it involves.
Yeah, and we had a discussion which actually sparked this episode, which is I say generally to get a binding financial agreement, which is also known as a BFA, for people when they are, especially if there is unequal assets at the start. And that's the term I always use when people are, I guess, looking for protection. But you said to me that a binding financial agreement is great, but not for everyone. So I guess the important question to ask is who does suit a binding financial agreement, and what would somebody use other than that?
Yeah, so just for people listening, a financial agreement is essentially a contract that two people enter into outside of court, and it can be entered into during a relationship, or at the very start.
Before you move in?
Like a prenup, but it also applies to people that don't want to get married. That basically says this is how we're going to divide our property in the event that we separate in the future. You can also do them at the end after you separate. You can say we've separated and this is how we want to divide the property. So they can be a really excellent way to avoid court and to have control over the process and say, well, no, we've reached a decision. This is how we want it to happen. The problem is that we cannot guarantee with absolute certainty that it will in fact be binding and not set aside by a court in the future. And so there have been over the past couple of years a number of cases where you've seen financial agreements set aside. And so what we then look at is what are the circumstances in which they're set aside? And more often than not, it's in circumstances where they were entered into where it was unfair. The agreement was unfair, or somebody was under pressure or duress. And the cases where you typically see that more often than not is where they're entered into in a very early stage of a relationship where there's an inequality in the bargaining position of the parties, or someone's got all of the money and all of the assets, and then they might go on to have children. And having kids is such an unknown. You don't know who the primary care is going to be. You don't know whether the children will have any health issues. You don't know how the roles that each of you agreed that you would do might change or how that might impact the relationship. So it's very hard to have a financial agreement that covers all of the contingencies, let alone then having children. So typically for young couples that might want to get married, that might want to have children, they might not be the best way to protect you because they could end up being unfair if they don't properly provide for what happens in the event of children. And it's quite rare, but all you have to do is say, what happens if one of the children have really high medical needs that aren't properly covered by that agreement? It will not be worth the paper it's written on, and the court will set it aside because it will cause financial hardship to the child or children of that relationship. So we as practitioners need to be very careful that we're not saying to people, yes, I can protect you. This document is bulletproof. You can trust me. Give me your money. When in fact the chances of that, being set aside are quite high in those types of circumstances.
So in those cases, might it be appropriate to get a binding financial agreement? Let's say a young couple are getting together, but there's an unequal amount of assets at the start. A binding financial agreement now, but then it would have to be reviewed in 5 years' time if their life changed and they entered a family arrangement.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is absolutely, I think what most lawyers would say would be the ideal way to approach it. And so some of the options that we have is that you can have a financial agreement at the start of a relationship, which basically gives you that peace of mind to cover the first period of time and to see how you go living together and whether it's going to work to protect those assets at the start. You can have a termination clause which basically terminates the financial agreement if there's children born. Okay. And then you renegotiate and potentially look at having another one or not having one and then leaving it open to discussion. But ideally, the best financial agreements are reviewed every 5 years to make sure that they properly cover the parties and still meet the needs of the person in terms of protection, and that you're looking at what might have changed and does it properly cover that. Because the reality is that the law changes all the time and it might be completely out of our control. The legislation might change and it might retrospectively impact an agreement in a way that we didn't foresee at the time. So it's a good idea to just keep looking at them and make sure that they still cover you.
And I know for me it was a second relationship and we weren't planning to have children. So it was just black and white that a binding financial agreement is the best way forward. But if you were a young couple and maybe you thought you're going to plan to have children and maybe you thought a binding financial agreement isn't for you, or you just thought that's a really expensive thing for us to do, are there some practical things that people can do at the start of a relationship, I guess, that they can do without a lawyer, maybe even, to help themselves protect their assets or outline things before they move in and I guess, join their finances?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of it would be kind of what we do is the financial agreement process anyway, but which is to look at and identify what is your income at this point in time? What assets do you have and what are they valued at? Because a lot of the time when you get to the separation stage and you're doing your settlement, it's relevant what people had at the start and what their initial contributions were, but no one has any evidence of it.
Yeah.
Because it could have been a long time ago. You might not be able to get that under subpoena anymore because no one keeps records past 7 years. And so if people going into a relationship can have records of, well, my house had a market value of X at this date, and I'm just going to pop this in a folder or on my computer somewhere. My bank account had X amount of dollars in it by way of savings. I had this share portfolio at this time. My car was worth X. My credit card had a balance of this at this time. If you have that, you are 95% ahead of most people when they get to the separation stage of being able to at least prove what your initial contributions were at the start. So if both people do that, it can be really useful then. I mean, it's not the end of it. It doesn't all turn on that point, but it's incredibly helpful to have those records available, and then coupled with a discussion around what's your view about this and how do you respond to this, and what's your values around money? And, I was joking with my partner in the car on the way up, if your partner had to go through your bank statements and see what you're spending money on, what are the things that you'd kind of be a little bit embarrassed about them seeing on your bank statements, and maybe having some conversations around, spending and how that might impact the relationship.
And I talk to some people that think that when they join finances, that's the part that actually binds them. But you said something earlier about that 2-year mark of living together. So tell me, why is that 2-year mark so important?
So, and I mean, I should say, and law's very annoying in this way, that's why lawyers always say may and possibly, and because it's never entirely black and white.
Yeah.
There's always exceptions to the rule. But generally speaking, a de facto relationship will be regarded as one where the parties have lived together for at least 2 years.
Okay.
So,
was that less time before?
No, and a lot of people think that it's 6 months, or that as soon as you start living together, and people think, oh, they're entitled to 50% because we've been living together for 6 months. Even if you live together for 2 years, it doesn't mean that there's necessarily any entitlement to any of your assets, because there needs to be a contribution to the assets in order for there to be an adjustment. So the way that it works is you look at what are the assets available. So you look at the assets, your liabilities, your super, financial resources, and then you work out what contributions have each party made to those, and is there any adjustment required because one or both parties has future needs, considerations that may need to be taken into account. For example, is there a child of the relationship? Are there health issues that might need to be covered by some additional support? But typically in short relationships, it comes down to what people put in. It's really focused on the financial contributions for short. And by short relationships, I mean under 5 years, classed as short. And there's a much stronger focus on your financial contributions in a shorter relationship than there would be in a long one. So if you're together for 20 years, what you have at the start is going to be much less relevant than what you had if you've been together for 3 years. That will pretty much determine the outcome if you come in with a huge amount of money.
And I think that's a fear for some people when you are, especially if somebody has built a property portfolio and maybe they're moving in with a partner that they're very much in love with but has a very different asset position. Maybe they don't get to the point of, getting married and having children, but how do I protect myself in this short little gap at the beginning before that happens? So you would say things like, sit down, have a conversation, document the conversation, and have proof of all of what I guess, your assets are at the start.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing really binding other than a financial agreement. So even if things are documented, it's not necessarily going to be, if you, for example, if you say, we agree that this is what's going to happen in the relationship, it won't bind anybody in any particular way. But it's just good so that you're both clear and on the same page and you understand.
And you've had the difficult conversation when everybody is getting along at the start, because it's a lot harder to have that conversation on the other end.
Yes. And if the relationship is broken down, faults become magnified. If someone's had smoked a joint in the relationship, it's often they're a drug addict, or if they've, watched a little bit of porn, they're, a porn addict, and it's, they have a glass of wine and they're an alcoholic, and you tend to look through a negative lens, I think, if the relationship has already broken down and there's mistrust or there's anger or hurt. And so if you have those discussions early on, I think it helps to stop a lot of it later on and what the big problems can be later on.
So I think a lot of people would be scared to call a lawyer. I think it's something, especially going into a relationship, let's say nothing's gone wrong. I think most people would call a lawyer at the first time if they've left their partner or thinking of leaving their partner. How would we encourage people to talk to a lawyer before they actually move in with someone? Like, is it a scary thing to do?
I mean, look at me. I'm not. I mean, I can be scary, but no. I think it's really important, and we're just humans, and that have a particular area of knowledge. And it would be like someone coming to you before they go to buy a house, to work out what can I borrow and what might I need to do to have that borrowing capacity. Do I need to get my spending in order? Do I need to improve my credit rating? It's kind of the same thing. It's like a health check for your, relationship, and sometimes can actually prevent a separation, because you say, well, if you do X, Y, Z, have these conversations, put these things in place, there might not be a fight about it later on. So if you can prove your house was worth X, there might not be a dispute about it, and you might not have to pay thousands of dollars to get a valuation later on down the track. So I think definitely educating people around, we're not just for the end. Our role is literally to tell people, this is how family law works. These are what your rights are. This is how the separation process works. This is how financial agreements during relationships work. And what to expect through the process. And I think a lot of my job is spent trying to convince people not to go to court.
Yes.
And not to fight, and to avoid going down that and try to look at ways to resolve it. But it can be really hard once that relationship has already broken down. But also if people have already made decisions that might not necessarily be in their best interest. So, for example, I will often talk to people about going to see a broker early and getting advice about, their borrowing capacity and getting their finances in order, and seeing an accountant and getting tax advice and seeing a counsellor and addressing it holistically, rather than if people have come to you and they've already taken money out of a joint account and they've, already sold things and they've already, put things in place that can't be undone. It can be very hard then for us to try to fix it once it's already gone a bit pear-shaped. So it's like damage control early on.
In the process. So we might take a break there and come back and talk about, I guess, the things to do when you're separating.
Yeah, great.